Good morning, and welcome to all our listeners and followers from the Dream Builders Australia blog, the Dream Builders Blog Talk radio show. And also, we'd like to give a shout out to all of the people who've contacted us about our guest today, Mark Anthony. Mark Anthony is, of course, a psychic medium. He's the author of many best-selling books. He is especially here today to talk about his latest book being The Afterlife Frequency. And The Afterlife Frequency is so exciting because it is a book that is really pioneering in the way that it is bridging science and spirituality. Today, we're going to talk about things like connection, rapport. We're going to talk about trusting yourself more. We're going to talk about how the book is a tool that is changing the world. It's emotionally gripping, well-written, and evocative. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mark into our setting here, and we're going to get on with this wonderful show. Hello, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Liara, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. We're very pleased to have you here today. We've had a number of people contact us about your new book and their enthusiasm about it. We want to send a shout out to the Harmonic Convergence of Soul group of thousands of people here between Australia and New Zealand. We also have a group of soulpreneurs that are worldwide who are very excited about the topics that you're covering. And I just want to thank everyone for being here because really this is truly life-changing for a lot of people. So maybe you can start by telling us what prompted you to write this incredible book, because there are so many books out there by psychic mediums, so many books that talk about the topics that you talk about: near-death experience, near-death visions, shared death visions, spiritual contact in general. But this one in particular, because it comes out in this time, this period of humanity's history, is especially poignant. Can you tell us your impression of why?
Well, there's so many reasons why I wrote this book, but the most condensed version, if you will, is that traditionally the different forms of spirit communication, whether it's direct contact, maybe you have a loved one visit you in a dream, or you feel the presence of a loved one's spirit. Maybe it's through a medium like me. Perhaps you've had a near-death experience, a shared death experience where somebody who is actively dying and they're interacting with spirits coming to greet them, and people in close proximity who are not dying are also having are seeing and experiencing what the transitioning person is. Then there's out-of-body experiences where people are able to take their consciousness, their soul, and basically it moves around at outside the body and then returns. And so what's happened over time is that these different phenomena have been treated as separate phenomena. It's kind of like a salad bar, the garbanzo beans are over here, the carrots are over there, the and it's not. And so after, growing up with a psychic medium, being always interested in the scientific explanation for spirit communication and the afterlife, I saw that there was a connection between all of it. And they're not separate phenomenon. There's nuances which give them differences, but they're all based on energy transfer and alignment with a higher frequency. That's why the name of the book is The Afterlife Frequency, because what's happening, Liara, is that in all these different forms of spirit communication, the frequency of our, what I call the electromagnetic soul, our EMS, rises to a higher level, higher vibration, and touches the frequency of the other side, the afterlife frequency. Think of it like this. We live in AM radio, the other side's FM radio, and we're meeting in the zone in between, frequency match, and there's the the basis for all these different forms of contact with spirits. And so the time for this is now, because the Afterlife Frequency, my book, bridges the divide between people of faith and people of science.
That's an excellent point, Mark. And you might also look at the fact that once we bridge the gap between the scientists and the people in spiritual circles, we're also looking at bridging the gaps between other divergences, because we have a lot of duality that's playing out at the moment, where people are looking at us and them. And the common ground that your book is laying out is reminding us of a common language that we can all relate to. And it's a lot harder to be in conflict with a group of people if you share the same language and you find what you have in common. I'm curious about what you're going to say.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I love that point, because that's exactly it. And that's one of the things that I'm doing with the Afterlife Frequency. And I started this in my prior book, my book before this, Evidence of Eternity. I started introducing new terminology to explain spirit communication. And then I took that much further in the Afterlife Frequency. And the reason for that is because so much of the terminology to describe spiritual phenomena was crafted in the Victorian era, the golden age of spiritualism from the mid 1800s up to about the 1930s. And that was groundbreaking at the time, but now it's antiquated because our understanding of quantum physics has literally warped, leaps and bounds into the future. So now it's time to explain this in terms of science, to take it out of the realm of woo-woo, fantasy, supernatural, to explain that these phenomenon are a normal part of nature. They're not paranormal, they're not supernatural, they're naturally and normally occurring.
That is so true. And just to follow on that, what's interesting is the fact that you aren't a scientist, and yet you have found the language to bridge sort of science and spirituality. And there are a number of terms that you present in your book. One most significant term that stands out for me is the electromagnetic soul. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about that, where that comes from, and how you came to be using scientific terms, because you're a lawyer and a psychic. And my understanding is you're not a scientist.
Well, the thing about being an attorney is that it puts you in everything. And what I mean by that is my first job in law, I was a prosecutor. I worked for the state of Florida, prosecuting criminals. And then I went into private practice, and I was involved with criminal defense, and then later in personal injury. And so what happens is in different types of cases, you have to study different disciplines, because I had witnesses who were physicists, who were forensics, who were chemists, who were biologists, who were neuroscientists, who were doctors. And so I had to learn all of these, because how can you put a doctor or a physicist on the witness stand if you don't understand what it is that they're talking about? Much less, how do you cross-examine the other side's expert who's there to destroy your position? So it required me to learn all these different disciplines. Plus, my dad was a NASA engineer. So I grew up with a guy that was working on how to put human beings in space, and did so successfully. So science has been part of my DNA. And I've always been interested in quantum physics, in biology and chemistry and archaeology, theology, philosophy. I just like learning. And so as a psychic medium, a person who communicates with spirits, see, I don't look at this as magic or fantasy. There is a logical and scientific explanation for everything. So this brings me to, where did the term the electromagnetic soul come from?
Exactly.
Well, every great spiritual teacher from the dawn of human history, we're talking the ancient Egyptians, the Hindu sages, all through Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Muhammad, Native American spiritualists. I mean, we're talking globally. The major belief systems all hold for the proposition that the soul, you can call it a soul or a spirit in realms of faith, is who and what we are. And that the soul pre-exists the body, comes into the body, and when the body no longer functions, moves on. And that's a basic tenet of all the major belief systems. We know from the laws of thermodynamics and physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. We know from neuroscience, the study of the human brain, that the brain has an electrical field. In fact, our whole body does. The most powerful electrical field in the body is in the heart, which makes sense. It's a pump. It's going 24/7. It needs a lot of energy. The most complex electrical system in the brain, in the body, is the brain, the cerebral cortex. And so that is what houses the soul. In other words, the brain no more creates consciousness than your computer hard drive created Windows 10, or I understand Windows 11 is on its way. Okay, great, we can hardly wait. but my point is that neuroscience is completely unable to explain how the brain creates consciousness. And if you look at a neuroscience book, there's 1,000 pages, let's say, and most of it is on the functions of the brain. Consciousness, you might find a paragraph, maybe two, because they don't know. So I developed the term the electromagnetic soul to describe what we really are, which is pure consciousness, which is eternal electromagnetic energy, neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. So it encompasses both the scientific and the spiritual. Dr. Gary Schwartz, who's head of psychology, parapsychology, physics, and chemistry at the University of Arizona, which hosts one of the most advanced afterlife research programs in the world, he wrote the foreword for my book. And he's such a great guy. And he called me up and goes, Mark, Electromagnetic Soul, I love it. I'm using it. I'm calling it the EMS. And he said, actually, he goes, this is what we've been working on for years, but your term is much more concise. We were calling it the electromagnetic dynamical brain body interface. He said, but what you've come up with explains it all. So may I use this term in my research? And I'm like, absolutely. What an honor.
Well, certainly when you simplify things, it makes it a lot easier for people to relate to it and use it, because when things are too complex, people tend to shy away and just not spend much time on it. Now, what you're sharing tells us a lot about your personality as an explorer, because certainly you're viewed as somewhat of a pioneer in your field because of how you bridge different disciplines. And I wonder if you might build on that whole concept of psychic explorer. Who initially gave you that label, and how has that been evolving with your ongoing changes?
The reason why I'm smiling, it seems like the media loves labeling me various things. And I remember when I first went public with my abilities, the media started calling me the psychic lawyer. And I remember my publicist said, great, let's go with it. That'll get you interviews. So here I am, But when people hear psychic lawyer, they think all I'm going to do is work on cold cases and find bodies. And I have done that. Okay. And I'm open to working on that. But because of, like I said, my background, my personality, I have always had a fascination with theology, which is not unusual for a medium. I mean, growing up, being able to see spirits, both of my parents had these abilities. I was always drawn to the spiritual. So I started studying so many different aspects of God. And I loved archaeology. I love ancient mysteries, history, and then, of course, the science. And I spent a lot of my free time traveling to mystical and spiritual sites around the world. I want to examine it. I remember the first time I went to Loch Ness, and it's so funny when you're walking around Loch Ness, every time you hear a splash in the water, you really want to see, some creature coming up and, out of the water. And I mean, it's hilarious. And when I was at Stonehenge, you're really expecting a UFO to land or something. But the thing is, once you get past the fantastical and the dynamic and begin to study these. So because of my travels around the world and in my writing, I incorporate the ancient basis for belief systems and different phenomena combined with science. One media outlet started calling me the psychic explorer. So what we decided is to, I'm now known as Mark Anthony JD, which is my law degree, Juris Doctorate, psychic explorer. So that puts it all into one. And that describes what I do, because with practicing law, and my time is now focused solely on my spiritual work, but I still appear on a number of TV and radio shows to discuss high profile cases as a legal analyst, because it's amazing how many times the paranormal and the legal system collide. And it happens a lot more than you might think. And because of my criminal background, when somebody claims, they're possessed by a demon and that's why they committed a murder, well, they'll bring me in. Or there's what happens if you buy a house and then you find out it's haunted. What are the legal ramifications about that? And it's amazing. And then it's even more interesting, the practical aspects. Okay, ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, they're all over the place. All right. And aren't they always doing their investigation at night in some abandoned warehouse or mental institution or whatever? And they're running around with flashlights and night vision goggles. Well, what happens when somebody falls down a stairwell and breaks their leg? All right. There's a whole plethora of insurance issues. In fact, Liara, there are even insurance companies who issue liability policies for paranormal investigators. I mean, so the media comes to me to discuss the paranormal and the legal ramifications of things like that. So I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does. It's quite funny you mentioned that, because if you watch a film like Ghostbusters, you don't tend to have someone falling down the stairs and looking for a lawyer because of liability issues.
Well, it happens.
For them.
Slip and falls happen. I mean, they happen in Bloomingdale's. They happen, on the street in London, wherever. I mean, people get hurt. I mean, there's always occupational hazards.
That's a good point. Well, you do mention in the course of that explanation the fact that you are a psychic. You realize that you were a psychic quite young. And I wonder, with the travel you describe, is that one of the ways that you started to begin to validate your impressions? Because one of the things that our viewers and listeners find in common is the idea when they start to connect with the spirit world, there is that period of self-doubt. There is that period of, well, do I trust this? And to what degree do I trust it? And in that regard, I wanted to ask you, at what stage of your life did you truly begin to trust the impressions you're getting from the unseen worlds and make steps to incorporate that into your day-to-day?
Well, it started when I was about 3.5, because I started interacting and talking to my invisible friends. Now, toddlers do that, all right? But when mommy and daddy can see who I'm talking to, that changes everything. And I remember my mother going, "Oh, he's got it." And my father's reaction was, "Oh, he's got it." Like that, because the two sides of the family were very, very different. My father's family, they were very conservative Baptist Christians from Pennsylvania, and my mother's family had emigrated from Italy. And the Italian side of the family, there's the psychic ability runs in my family back into the 1890s. And my mother had this ability, as did her maternal grandmother, Giovanna. In fact, PBS, Public Broadcasting, did a special called The Italian Americans in 2016. It was a 4-hour, 2-night special. And they actually spent an entire segment on Giovanna And they talked about, she was known as the woman who knows things in the Italian community of New York and North New Jersey. And priests, nuns, cardinals, bishops, officials from the Catholic Church would come and consult with her and talk to her. And in the Italian side of the family, looked at this as a vision, a gift of the Holy Spirit. Whereas my dad's side of the family, it was behind closed doors and it simply wasn't discussed. So I grew up in this environment where I remember when I was about to start grade school, I was going to Catholic school and I was 5 years old. And my father said, Mark, don't talk about this to anyone except your mother and I, because people won't understand, and people who see things others don't get taken away.
Historically, that happened a lot.
Well, what he was referring to, and I didn't discover this until years later, his sister Marjorie, my dad had 3 sisters and a brother, and his sister Marjorie was gifted like he was, and she could foretell future events in addition to communicate with spirits. So about 20 years before I was born, she was married to this evangelical, fundamentalist, and he didn't like what she did. And one day he was going to work. He was a machinist who worked at a steel factory in Pennsylvania. And one morning she said, I'm feeling this terrible sensation in the pit of my stomach. Please don't go to work. Please don't. She begged him, they had a big argument. He said, fine, I'll stay home. It was to placate her because she was basically throwing a fit. That day at the steel plant, this crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and the cable snapped and it crushed the machine shop that he worked in and killed everybody in it. Now, logically, he would have been there. But instead of being grateful, he felt that what she was doing was unnatural and evil. And he got an unscrupulous psychiatrist to diagnose her as schizophrenic. So she was forcibly taken from her home and involuntarily subjected to electroshock therapy of her brain for over 6 months. Wow. And it did so much damage to her that she never could see spirits again or saw the future. And my father and mother, when they discovered what had happened, they were furious with this man. And so when I started manifesting these inherited abilities, my father wasn't trying to be unkind to me. He was trying to protect me. I mean, he was a Navy SEAL. That was his thing, protecting people. And I was his little boy, and he wanted to protect me. And so I saw pretty quickly that talking about seeing spirits was not something you should do in Catholic school. So I got the memo. And it wasn't until I started getting in my 20s, my abilities just they were always there. They started intensifying. And so it was always there, and it intensified to the point where I just had to get to the point where I embraced it.
Yes, for a lot of people, they do tend to reach that tipping point. I know I can relate to what you're saying on many levels, because I had a mother who was a psychiatrist, and at different periods in history, of course, in the scientific community, certain behaviors are regarded as deviant or unacceptable, abnormal. And that has been progressively changing in some areas, which helps to validate what you do, for example, and what many more people are doing. And as you come to trust yourself more as an adult, where have you found that you have made significant life changes based on validating your inner voice? Because intuition is so important.
I mean, we could spend all day just answering that question, but what happened was, in the legal profession, I was respected, but I was always looked at as a bit weird.
Because, that word.
Yeah, but go figure, right? Well, particularly when I was a prosecutor. and they would bring in the prisoners who had been, because when you get arrested, you have to be brought before a judge within 24 hours so the judge can determine whether or not you should be released or should there be bail or whatever. And when you're a young attorney fresh out of law school, you get stuck doing first appearances, is what they're called, arraignments, first appearances, usually on weekends and holidays. And I would have a co-counsel there, and they'd come in and I'd say, okay, that one drunk driving, that one looks like a child molester, that one spouse battery, that one. And my co-counsel was looking at the police reports. He said, how do you know that? I haven't even shown you the police reports. Because, and let's face it, people that have been sitting in the drunk tank all night, they all have this grungy, worn out look. And I'm, not being insulting, but, for anybody, it wouldn't matter who you were, you're sitting in there all night with, and it's real frenetic. And so it kind of got to be a little bit of a game. Like, let's see if Mark can figure out what they're charged with before we show it to him, And I started using this ability as well, particularly when I was selecting juries. And there was one case where I was now on the defense side, and I was representing this big bruiser guy, and he got in a fight with another guy in a bar. And what had happened was my client beat the daylights out of the other guy, so he filed charges. All right. So it was mutual combat between two big brutes. But it was a crime of violence. And so before a trial officially begins, we have to select the jury. And you have maybe 20 or 30 prospective jurors. And then in Florida, you whittle down a case of this size to a jury of 6 plus 1 alternate. And so both sides get to ask the prospective jurors questions so we can, find any prejudices they may have one way or the other. And now it was my turn. And there was this one woman on the jury, and I just kept getting drawn to her. And I felt like a female presence around her, and I kept feeling this tightening around my neck. And it was very uncomfortable. And I was like, okay, somebody connected her on the other side, couldn't breathe before, was obstruction with breathing. And so I stand up and I'm doing my bit. And I figured a very standard question, but I looked at the prospective jurors and I said, has anyone here or anyone in your family been the victim of a violent crime? Well, lo and behold, she looks up to me, and I'll never forget, she was just such a sweet looking person. I mean, she had, olive complexion, these beautiful dark eyes, and the tears started coming out of her, and she was shaking. And she said, a year ago, my sister was in a foreign country when an escaped mental patient strangled her, dismembered her body, and threw her in a garbage can.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And I'm standing there and my client's like, dude, what are you doing? And all I'm thinking, Liar, is they didn't teach me in law school how to deal with this. And now I'm really starting to pick up on this woman's spirit coming through. And if your listeners want to find out what happens, they're going to have to read my first book, Never Letting Go.
Gosh, well, I can say to all of our listeners that your books are very engaging and engrossing. So I can imagine that that would be a great suggestion for people to pick them up if they haven't done so already. It also is a great segue into looking at your book in a bit more detail, your most recent book, of course, The Afterlife Frequency, and the way that you weave stories in and out of that book. And I find that it's a very unique thing that you do, because you're almost like an observer in what's going on. And you sort of invite people to step out of themselves, out of their bodies, however you want to describe it, in order to see things from a different point of view. And I wonder if there's a particular reason why you have chosen to present those stories in that way.
I suffered through so many boring books in the practice of law and in law school, where I have to trudge through data and legal opinions. And I always thought, I'm not going to do that to anybody, because I always knew I was going to write books someday. And I figured, and I learned this from the practice of law, is we have to take these very complex concepts and then present it to a jury in a way anyone can understand it. And jurors aren't stupid. And I mean, they're people. And because a lot of attorneys come across as very condescending. I realize you're all a bunch of morons, so I'll make this as simple as possible. And I could never stand when I'd see attorneys treat jurors like that. What it is, when people hear quantum physics or they hear these terms, they're like, oh, I don't know if I want to read that. The thing is, though, I learned how, through the practice of law, to take a complex concept and explain it in a way anybody can understand it, and then illustrate it with a story that will resonate with them. And I like interesting stories. I like adventure. I like things that are thought-provoking. So I write it, I guess, as much for myself as I do anybody else, because the way I look at it, Liara, if I can't feel it, if it doesn't move me, then how is it going to move my readers? And I've always felt that people should be educated, engaged, and entertained. So that's why I write all my books to read. They read like a novel, but there's a lot of information in there, and I do the very best to back up every one of my theories with science. Because too many mediums are like, oh, spirit said this and spirit said that and la da 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 da, and there's nothing there. There's no substance. Mm-hmm. So what they're doing is giving a subjective account of something without backing it up with science and objectivity. And I guess once again, that's from court. I mean, I could go into court and say, well, my client is innocent because I think he is.
And I'm sure they would probably throw you out of court. But yes, I know exactly what you're saying. You definitely need to offer some sort of, you could say, evidence or information that enables people to relate to it. And for some people, they look at that as information as proof. And for other people, they connect with it in a different way. And this is another aspect of your recent book, The Afterlife Frequency, which really stands out because we look at the theme of connection. And we talked about the common language of energy. And you mentioned the electromagnetic soul is one term that you've coined in this book. But another language that you seem to be using is the language of emotion and the way that you invite your readers to engage. And that's something that I invite our readers and our viewers to discover for themselves, because really it's a unique experience. And I wonder if, when it comes to a number of mental illnesses or imbalances and experiences people are having related to COVID and what's going on worldwide, how they can benefit from your book, because you mentioned things like PTSD, you mentioned stress, you mentioned other homicide, suicide, very difficult situations, some of which you may have encountered as a lawyer as well. But yes, you present those in a way that's very engaging in your book. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
It's a big part of the book is about explaining the scientific basis for the different forms of spirit contact. Another component is healing. And because how many parents who've lost a child suffer from survivor's guilt? The parent, may have had absolutely no involvement, with the cause of the child's death. Okay. But it's very normal for parents to feel that, well, I should have died. Why did I live when my baby, my son, my daughter has died? And that needs to be addressed. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I give a number of examples of this in my book, but look at all the veterans we have coming back from the Middle East, from other areas of the world, who are suffering with all types of psychological discord, distress, because of things that they've been through. I mean, post-traumatic stress can be for a victim of a crime. I mean, certainly rape victims suffer from PTSD. Family members who have lost a loved one to murder or to suicide oftentimes are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the problem in Western society is that we ignore these things. We don't address them. You said that your mother was a psychiatrist. So, denial is not just a river in Africa. Okay. Yeah, we've got to discuss these things. We've got to present them. I do a lot of work with, I've done a lot of readings for people in the military. A lot of these military guys and women, they're not going to cry. They don't want to cry. That would be weak, but they're hurting every bit as bad as anybody else. And they'll come to me because I'm a male medium, and they'll feel more comfortable talking to me. And so that's why I felt that a healing component was very, very necessary. And look what's going on with COVID now. I just saw on the news that 800,000 people have now died from COVID in the United States alone, and that 1 out of every 100 people over the age of 65 have died from COVID in the United States. And I hear people say, oh, well, that's not that many. Okay, well, what if everybody in that person who said that, what if everybody in your family over the age of 65 died? Would it feel like not that many now? And the thing is, it's only going to get worse until it gets better. And so we're facing a very unique time. Every generation has its challenge. We have a pandemic. And I have heard a lot of people say, well, this is terrible, this is terrible. And how could this happen to us? I remember, Lyra, when I was 15 years old, I met this woman named Anita. And I was a history buff then. Okay, I've been a history buff from day one. And Anita was English. And I discovered she had lived through the bombing of London, the air blitz, when the Luftwaffe was bombing trying to bomb Britain into submission. And so I was all ears, and I wanted to listen to everything she had to say. And she was just a little bit older than I was at the time, at the time it was happening. And she said, my father was in the Royal Navy, and we didn't know, what was going on with him. And it was my mother and I, and some days, we would go to work or school, and it wasn't there because it had been bombed. And then she said, and then at nighttime was the worst, because then the Germans be hitting us. And there we were huddled in the tubes, the subway tunnel. She goes, not very British, being all huddled with other people and sharing their emotions. And I said, how did you survive? She said, stiff upper lip, Mark. She said, it's not like we had a choice. She said, and when you're faced with a challenge, you can either fall apart, which wasn't done, or you rise to the occasion. And I was so inspired. I'll never forget, though, she was talking about this young man. She called him Lofty. He was real tall, so his nickname was Lofty, and he lived in a flat near her. And she said one night his flat, the building that his flat was in, was bombed. They never found his body. And I remember a tear rolling down her cheek. She goes, hell of a nice guy, Lofty. She had a crush on him. And it really, really hit me. And so when COVID hit and all these people, oh, we got to wear a mask, and then it's like, yeah, well, the Luftwaffe is not hitting us every day. Okay. It's sometimes we have to take things in perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we're not getting bombed by the Luftwaffe every day, but we have a pandemic here, and people are dying. People in my family have died from COVID. This is really, really hurting a lot of people. And so instead of pretending that death doesn't exist and just sort of, don't think about it, we have to have open discussions about death. And for me, perhaps one of the most healing modalities is the knowledge that who we loved did not just disintegrate, but their electromagnetic soul is eternal energy that has transferred to another frequency. And that when the time is right, it can be very therapeutic, very healing to make contact with your loved ones in spirit.
Yes, I can certainly understand that. And a number of our listeners would definitely agree with you. The other thing that stands out is the analogy of water. Of course, the solid, the liquid, and the gas, and the fact that we are all water, or 90% plus. And it helps people to look at analogies at times, especially a scientist or someone who's more oriented in that direction. And if you can look at water and understand that it does change state from solid to liquid to gas, and there are variables that affect that, such as temperature, circumstance, you can also begin to see, well, when the water becomes a solid and then a gas, it's still there, even if you don't always see it. And it's a great analogy for what you talk about, because when you look at everything as energy, whether you see it or not, you start to understand the presence of energy, and it helps people not only find they're on the same page and relate differently, but also deal with emotions that come up related to it. Now, you bring up the subject of death, which is a topic that tugs at some heartstrings. It causes other people to withdraw. It's one of those topics that is often avoided with things like politics, religion, and sometimes COVID with people these days, because it tends to evoke conflict. But death is something that you deal with in a very unique way. And one of the things that I find remarkable is the fact that you have near-death experience researchers that validate and endorse the work that you do. And I can relate to that again, and so can many of our viewers and listeners, because I've had near-death experiences, but not everyone has. And so I wanted to ask you, first of all, have you had a near-death experience? And secondly, when it comes to sharing that kind of a story, how do you feel it's possible to enable people who haven't had a near-death experience to relate to it, to benefit from the story?
Yes, I have had a near-death experience, and I write about it in the Afterlife Frequency, but I'm not going to tell about it.
Good.
Because what occurred to me in there is integral to the entire book, so I don't want to give the spoiler alert. And how do you persuade or convince people who have not had an NDE that such things exist and they're not merely a side effect of the dying brain? And I refute all of the skeptics' points in the Afterlife Frequency. I take them one by one by one. And, we're recording this show, I guess about 10 days or so before Christmas. And I'm going to bring up something which is both seasonal and related to near-death experiences. And this is not in my book, but this was actually in a lecture that I presented recently at the International Association for Near-Death Studies. How many of your listeners have seen A Christmas Carol? Okay, we've all seen it, right? We've all seen A Christmas Carol, okay? And all the different versions of it. I particularly liked, there was one about 5 or 6 years ago with Vanessa Williams where she plays this like Motown star, and instead of the spirits, it's what she's seeing like on MTV about her, But the thing is, think about it, it's very possible that A Christmas Carol is an account of a near-death experience. And we know that Charles Dickens, he was in several harrowing experiences throughout his life. In fact, he was in a terrible train wreck, but it was after he wrote A Christmas Carol where he should have died. But be that as it may, near-death experiences have existed and been documented for thousands of years. So, and not all near-death experiences are about going through a tunnel into the light and seeing loved ones and angels. Some of them are what's known as a distressing near-death experience, a DNDE, aka a hellish near-death experience. So here we are, Ebenezer Scrooge, wealthy, materialistic, superficial, narcissistic, mean old man. And he's like bah humbug with Christmas, barely gives Bob Cratchit a day off on Christmas, but he goes home, and who's he confronted by? The first spirit is his former business partner, Jacob Marley, who's covered in chains and suffering because all he cared about was materialism. All right, he dismisses that. So then he has a succession of 3 spirits. Ghost of Christmas Past. Well, this could very well be the life review, which is an integral part of a near-death experience. Your proverbial life flashes before your eyes. What does he see? When he was a nice guy, when he was a young man, he had a fiance, he loved her, but the lust for money began to become more important. Then the Ghost of Christmas Present could be a continuation of the life review, where he's now seeing what he's like: cold-hearted, mean-spirited, narcissistic. The only thing he loves are material things and money. And then there's the hellish NDE component, which shows him his bleak future. When he dies, people scoff and laugh at his memory and say what a miserable person he was. Basically, the world's better that he's no longer in it, that he'll be forgotten. And he also sees that little tiny Tim is going to die, you know. And so when he comes out of this, he thinks that several days have passed, but very little time has passed. And this also ties into something that NDEers experience, which is timelessness.
Yes.
And so, because, and I explain this as well in the book. And so many people in 5 to 10% of near-death experiences were noticing they have these DNDEs, these distressing near-death experiences, and it's a cosmic wake-up call. People go, when they die, they don't see angels and unicorns and rainbows and all that. They see a very different fate awaiting for them, and they turn their lives around. Now, we're not exactly sure why this happens, because the vast majority of NDEers and the vast majority of people like yourself, mediums, we don't believe in hell. Okay, we don't believe in hell in the archetypal sense. I believe in hell in that it exists here on Earth, but that's another discussion. But if you look at A Christmas Carol, it appears that Charles Dickens got the idea for it from different accounts of near-death experiences. And that also may be why it's such an enduring story, and there's all these different versions of it, because it also gives us hope. No matter how rotten you may be, you and you alone have free will and can turn things around. And that's also a component of a near-death experience. When people come out of an NDE, and an NDE is when you die, here we are in the material world, and the energy of your EMS, the vibrational frequency, increases. Here's the afterlife frequency, and you just touch it. Now, if you can let go and go into it, then that's when you're going to be communicating through me to your loved ones. But with an NDE, it's like, you know, you're tethered still to this world, you touch the afterlife frequency, you get a glimpse, and then you come back. People feel interconnectedness, a sense that everyone and everything in the universe is interconnected. Fascinating. Quantum physics calls that quantum entanglement. Okay, everything is energetically linked on the subatomic level. People become less materialistic. They lose their fear of death. They have a different sense of time. All right. All of these are in A Christmas Carol. All of these are the positive and the incredible side effects of NDEs. Even the people that have the distressing NDEs, it turns them around. So I just thought, you know, because of the timing of the show, I thought I would like, you know, thank you for letting me present that.
That's very, very relevant. And I love the way that you're sort of bridging another theme that we're exploring about your book, the universality, and the fact that the world is going through many different kinds of changes right now. And depending on how you look at it, there are people who look at it as in terms of chaos and confusion and illness, and, you know, there's a negative side, but there's also a positive side. Some people see that in order for new things to emerge, new worlds to emerge, new ways of living to emerge, we first have to dismantle the old. And when you talk about the near-death experience, as you do with Scrooge, it's interesting that there are different ways that people wake up. Some people wake up because they have a nightmare once. Some people need repeated nightmares to get their attention. and some people don't wake up after a number of nightmares even again. But the near-death experience is something that brings the theme of death back into discussion. It's a topic that many people wish to avoid because it makes them feel uncomfortable. And in your book, you introduce it in a way that is something we can put into day-to-day conversation in a way that feels comfortable. And I wonder if you look at your book in terms of an influence in this evolution of humanity in that regard, because there are a lot of people who are going through different kinds of transitions. You can look at transitions related to health, related to job changes, geographic moves, relationship changes. There are a lot of people in transition. And I wonder if you see the book as a tool in some way that can help people through these transitions into a new way of living.
That certainly is the intent, because when I write books, and all of them, but in particular the Afterlife Frequency, I wanted it to help people understand that physical death is not the end of existence. Mm. And we're also getting to a point now where I'm always reading the research on belief systems, and traditional belief systems tend to be declining. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean people aren't looking for a connection to the divine. They're not, they're looking for this. It's just a lot of people look at these belief systems that were developed in the Bronze and the Iron Age, maybe not as having the relevance to them that maybe they once did. And I'm not crashing on religions, but this is what the statistics are showing. So whether or not people don't want to follow a dogma does not preclude them from wanting to have that connection. And so that's one of the objectives of the Afterlife Frequency. And earlier you asked me, why did I write this book? And I have so many reasons why I wrote this book, which are not in the book. But I do want to tell this one is my best friend. His name was Billy, and Billy's in chapter 1 of the Afterlife Frequency. We met when we were 11. We went to junior high school, college together. After college, I went to law school. He went to Asia, and he was teaching Japanese executives how to speak conversational English. He had an aptitude for languages. He could speak Cantonese, Thai, Indonesian, Japanese, and of course, English. And so I took some time off, and we had all these incredible adventures in Japan and Thailand. And he was my brother. I mean, for all intents and purposes. I mean, 11 years old, entire lifetime together. And even though we'd both been raised in the Catholic faith, he was an atheist. And I, of course, advocated the other side, but we had this lifelong debate, Liara, about the existence of God. It really started in high school, and it got more intense, especially when in Asia, because I'm always at every Buddhist temple. I was in there talking with the monks and praying with them. And he'd be saying, he goes, I don't really believe in this. He goes, but that psychic thing, I don't know how you can do it. And I said, well, Billy, there's an afterlife. He said, but there's no science, there's no technology to prove it. Mm. And no machines, no devices that can detect this. And the reason I want to say, indulge me for a minute, if you will. I remember when the happiest days of my life, I performed the wedding ceremony when he married this incredible woman that he met in Japan. And it was here in Florida. It was an outdoor wedding. It was overlooking the ocean at this beautiful hotel. And Liara, everybody I loved was there. My parents were there, his parents, all of our friends from college. I mean, it's like, it was just one of those shining moments in life it just doesn't get better than that. And 3 years after that, he succumbed to suicide.
It's hard.
And I was absolutely devastated. And then that's a whole story, because I remember his wife, she called me and she explained that, he'd taken all these drugs, and he had grappled with depression and alcoholism, and things were really, there was difficulty. And she said, the doctors want me to kill him. they want me to remove life support. She goes, I cannot do that. And I knew her. I got to know her very well. She's so Japanese and so, the sanctity of life. And I said, then don't do it. Don't do it. Something told me don't do it. And she told him, no, I'm not doing this. And he expired on his own 3 hours later.
Mm.
And so a year and a half after that, I was speaking at a paranormal convention at Estes Park in Colorado. And it's a really fascinating hotel, a lot of paranormal activity there, which is why the convention is there. And I had just given my presentation, so I'm down in the conference, the conference hall, and I was signing, autographing the book that had just come out, Never Letting Go. And my manager, Rocky, travels with me, and she was walking around looking at the other exhibitors because they had a number of people from TV and all these paranormal investigators, and they were displaying all the different forms of ghost hunting, paranormal investigation equipment, all of which scan the electromagnetic band, that infrared, ultraviolet scanners, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. And then she walked by this one device called the Spirit Box. And this guy named Chris was manning the table there. And as she walked by, she hears, "Get Mark." And she stops and she looks at this device. And the Chris looked at her and goes, "Did that just talk to you?" And then she hears again, "Get Mark." And he goes, do you think he means your Mark Anthony? So all of a sudden I hear, "Mark, get over here." And I look up and they're waving. And so I get up and I run over and I get up to this thing. And also my heart almost stopped because I heard, "Dude." And I looked at Rocky and tears are in her eyes. And before I could say anything else, it said, "Love you, bro." And I go, "Oh my God." She goes, "Mark, that was Billy." And because she knew him too. And I go, "That was his voice." And see, we grew up in the surfing culture of East Coast Florida, and he always called me dude and bro. In fact, and let's see if I can say this without losing it, the last thing he ever said to me was, "Love you, bro." And so here I am, and there's this machine where his voice is coming out of it. And this crowd of people's all around, and I was explaining, who he was and all this. And I thought about that long and hard for years. And, as a medium, I'm the one that's, I'm used to the one giving people messages that, oh my gosh, because, some of these things are very startling for people, but now it was happening to me. And then it dawned on me, this was spiritual synchronicity, where a spirit helped maneuver things into place. My friend, the atheist, who told me there's no science, there's no technology, there's no devices that can detect spirits, what did he choose to communicate with me through? Not another medium, but a technological device. And it got my wheels turning, and I go, "Okay, Billy, now I know what you're doing here." And that got me on the path. And this is answering the question you asked me initially, what made you think about writing this book, is all those reasons that the different forms of spirit communication all have the commonality of energy transfer and frequency alignment. And then when that happened, it dawned on me that God has a delivery system, and it's called quantum physics. None of this is magic. None of this is happen chance. There is a logical explanation for everything, even the spiritual. And maybe our technology at this point is rudimentary, but it's not going to stay rudimentary. I mean, the one thing about technology, it breeds more technology. Science breeds more science. When we make one discovery, when we answer one question, it presents 10 more. So it's only a matter of time before science discovers the afterlife. And it already has. It's just that the technology to do this is being refined. My friend and the scientist who wrote the foreword for the Afterlife Frequency, Dr. Gary Schwartz, is working on the Soul Phone project, which is technology not just detects spirits, but actually communicates with them. And so this is happening. And in the meantime, we're the technology. And that's why I teach people in the Afterlife Frequency, also teach them how to recognize the presence of spirits, accept the contact is real, feel it without overthinking it, and trust in the message. And that's what I did when Billy gave me that. I recognized his voice. I accepted the contact as real. I felt it without overthinking, oh, this must be some, coincidence. You get that out of the way. And then I trusted it was him. And then as time progressed, the message unfolded. And these are all concepts that I write about, the unfolding. It can take hours, days, weeks, or longer for the full impact of spiritual contact to really make sense to you. And that is what happened with that incident. And that is why I wrote the Afterlife Frequency.
Thank you for that explanation. It really does answer a lot of the questions that have been put forward by some of our listeners and readers. Just before we come to the end of this interview, which is really quite profound, I wanted to comment on what you just finished explaining to us, because one thing you explore in the book is collective consciousness. And you're talking about the progression or changes in popular culture, how we view death, how we view ourselves, how we view ourselves as technology, how we're sort of bridging worlds, science, spirituality, but also the worlds of life and death. And I wonder if you might comment on how you perceive collective consciousness, how you feel this is shifting, changing in our world, and how your book is contributing to that progression.
Collective consciousness, in a nutshell, is think of your EMS, your electromagnetic soul, like a drop of water. And when your body physically dies, that drop of water plunges into this eternal sea of souls, collective consciousness. You still maintain your individuality, the who and what you are, but now you're energetically bonded. You're linked to other spirits, linked to other spirits, linked to other spirits. So that's why many times in spirit communication, or pretty much always, spirits are able to transmit information that far exceeded the scope of anything that they knew in this world. This has been something that the Hindus and the Buddhists have talked about for thousands of years. Edgar Cayce referred to this as the universal mind. Even Nikola Tesla referred to the world as a one universal mind that'll be united by technology. So the collective consciousness, understanding that the other side, everything and everybody is linked, but see, we are here too. Like we're all brothers and sisters. The problem is because of our lower, slower vibration, and because our EMS is temporarily housed in this body, we tend to think that we're isolated individuals when we're not. And it's a shame that all the world leaders don't get a real good dose of collective consciousness insight, because we now possess weapons that can destroy life on this planet as we know it. I mean, humanity's always been violent, and there's always been discord and strife, but unfortunately our technology for destruction has progressed at such an incredible pace. But the awareness that we're all interconnected is beginning to grow. And this is nothing new. It's just now we're beginning to see it in the quantum physics sense. I mean, didn't Jesus say that we're all brothers and sisters? Did Buddha ever say, well, you can't like the people from Tibet because they look different than us? No, of course not. Of course not. And so now we're beginning to see these ancient and very true concepts in a new way, which I believe is going to help, hopefully, shift the consciousness to more of a global mindset. However, there will always be narcissistic manipulative, power-hungry personalities. And if you don't believe me, just read a history book.
That is a very good point. And I think many people would probably prefer reading the Afterlife Frequency than some of the dry history books that are out there.
Certainly, certainly. And it's funny because one of the presentations that I give is called Rulers, Royals, Psychics, and Spirits. It's the mystics behind the thrones of power, because people throughout history have had psychic advisors on the QT, and this includes 1/3 of US presidents, but I'll leave that for another time.
I can understand that. Well, I want to remind our readers that they can pick up your book from theafterlife.com, from booktopia.com.au, and a number of other outlets, Amazon being one of them. And the afterlifefrequency.com also has information about Mark in general and how you can connect with him, get a reading with him, learn more about his books and his events. And I wonder if, as we end this interview, Mark, that you could perhaps leave us with a message for the world that you feel this book helps to leave, and that will give us something to reflect on, because the themes you cover in this book are quite amazing and profound. You bring up connection, you bring up how we can all connect in a different way through the language of energy. And I feel that that has far-reaching implications. So thank you again for the interview, and please do leave us with the message that you'd like to have us go away with.
The message that I have is a 5-point message. 1, God exists. 2, heaven, nirvana, the afterlife, whatever you want to call the existence beyond this one, exists. That our electromagnetic soul is an eternal living being. 4th, that we can communicate with souls. And 5th, that we'll be reunited with our loved ones in the light of the afterlife frequency, when it is our appointed time to leave this material world.
Thank you so much, Mark, for all of this insight into your new book, into your life, and into your perception of the progression of humanity into a more tightly knit collective consciousness. And I'd like to thank all of our viewers and listeners out there across Australasia and the world, because we know that it's amazing how people find us when they're ready. Just like they find you, Mark, they find books like The Afterlife Frequency because they're ready to step out of the familiar into something new, to step fearlessly into the unknown. Thank you again, and season's greetings to everyone. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thanks, Mark.